He took the bullets meant for another, threw himself between death and the man he refused to leave behind, bleeding into the dust as the world turned its back and wrote both of them off as casualties of war. No name, no medals, no final farewell, just a trail of blood fading into forgotten soil. But loyalty like his doesn't vanish so easily, doesn't die because the world demands it. He clawed his way through the wreckage of betrayal, through cages meant to through the cold weight of abandonment, carrying a memory sharper than any wound. They called him lost, broken, useless, but they were wrong, because some spirits are forged too deep for the world to erase. And tonight, his story will rise from the ashes they thought would bury him. He isn't a soldier in uniform. He isn't a hero carved in stone. He is something older, fiercer, purer, the last unbroken promise of a battlefield that tried to devour him. If you believe loyalty can survive where men fall, if you think some bonds refuse to die, then hit like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from, because this isn't just a story about survival. It's about what refuses to be forgotten. The morning mist clung low to the ground, a thin, shivering sheet that wrapped the K-9 facility in ghostly silence. Sergeant Mason Weller pushed the iron gate open, with a soft groan of metal against metal. His boots crunching against the gravel, he made his way across the courtyard. Every kennel he passed erupted into a frenzy of barking and clawing except one. At the far end, in the last cage bathed in the pale glow of a flickering overhead light, Rex sat stone still, his massive frame rigid, his golden brown eyes locked on the empty space beyond the door. He hadn't moved an inch. Mason sighed, the weight of fatigue pressing down on him as he approached. "Rex," he called gently, but the German shepherd didn't even flick an ear, not even a twitch. Instead, Rex's nose nudged closer to the crack under the door, breathing in someone that wasn't there. It was the third morning in a row. Third morning he refused food. Third morning he ignored every command, every temptation. Third morning he waited, not for Mason, not for the caretakers, for someone else. 3 days ago, Rex had torn through the heavy iron of his enclosure like a dog possessed. Not to run away, but to stand rigid by the exit gate, his body vibrating with a desperate, silent longing. Since then, he hadn't touched water, hadn't acknowledged toys, hadn't so much as lifted his tail in greeting, and it gnawed at Mason's gut harder than any disciplinary report or failed training session ever could. "You got a stubborn case of heartbreak," Dr. Eliza Monroe said later that afternoon, flipping through the final pages of Rex's medical chart. The fluorescent lights of the exam room buzzed overhead, casting sharp angles across the clean white walls. Mason leaned against the counter, arms folded tightly, watching as the vet shook her head. "Blood work, normal. X-rays, normal. Heart, lungs, digestion. He's a poster child of physical health." She flipped the folder shut with a final, decisive snap. "It's not his body that's broken." Mason frowned, the heaviness inside him deepening. "Then what the hell is it?" Dr. Monroe leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper. "It's his mind, his memory." She tapped the side of her head. "Whatever he's waiting for, it's not here. And until he finds it, he's not coming back to us." Mason ran a hand down his face, feeling the scratch of 3 days' stubble. He'd worked with enough canine units to know. A dog could grieve, yes. But this wasn't grief. This was loyalty distilled into something raw and merciless. Something that refused to let go. That night, as the facility lights dimmed and the world outside swallowed into velvet blackness, Mason watched from his tiny office window. In the faint beam of the moon, he saw Rex again, lying with his nose just inches from the door, body trembling with silent anticipation, as if any second now, the one he waited for would step through, as if faith itself had weight and Rex was shouldering every ounce of it alone. In that frozen frame of night, Mason realized this was no ordinary dog. This was a soldier still waiting for his missing comrade, a bond unbroken by time, distance, or even death. The next morning, Mason called in the best trainer he knew. Captain Laura Griggs had been a legend back when Mason was still learning how to keep a leash from tangling in his boots. And if anyone could crack through whatever invisible wall Rex had built around himself, it was her. Laura arrived before sunrise, her silhouette cutting clean lines against the golden wash of early light, her battered cap pulled low over sharp green eyes. Without a word, she entered Rex's enclosure, tossing a battered tennis ball lightly from hand to hand. But Rex didn't even blink. He just lay there, coiled and still, his gaze locked once again on the door that never opened. Laura crouched, setting the ball down beside her, and began issuing basic commands. "Sit," she said, clear and firm. "Nothing. Stay, not a flicker." She shifted tactics, varying her tone, speeding up and slowing down her delivery. But Rex remained an immovable statue, breathing but barely present. Frustration began to creep into Laura's posture, her jaw setting tighter with each ignored word. Mason watched from the observation window, his arms crossed so tightly across his chest that his muscles ached. Then, on a sudden impulse, Laura lowered her voice, imbuing it with a deep timbre, slower, almost drawling in a rhythm that felt oddly familiar. "Rex," she rumbled, her voice taking on a register several notes below her usual tone. "Heel." The effect was instantaneous. Rex's ears twitched, his massive head lifting an inch from his paws. Mason shot forward against the glass, heart hammering in his ribs. "Feel," Laura repeated, mimicking the same deep resonance. This time Rex pushed himself upright, sluggishly but deliberately, his movements stiff as if he was dragging himself up from the bottom of a dark, forgotten well. He stood, trembling slightly, and took one slow step toward Laura. It was like watching a spell break, or perhaps the first crack in armor forged from pain. Laura didn't move. She simply kept her posture open, non-thumbnail, her voice an anchor tossed into stormy water. "Good boy," she murmured in that same low cadence, and Rex, with visible effort, lowered his massive frame into a sit at her side. Mason burst into the room a heartbeat later, his boots slapping the concrete as he crossed the space in 3 long strides. "Did you see that?" he barked. Laura didn't take her eyes off Rex. "It's not the words," she said, voice soft but sure. "It's the voice, the tone. He's not responding to commands, he's responding to someone." Mason's mind reeled, gears turning at a furious pace. A dog didn't imprint like this on just anyone. Whoever had trained Rex had left a mark so deep, so burned into his soul, that no one else could reach it unless they somehow echoed that original voice. "You need to find out who he belonged to," Mason said, determination hardening his voice into steel. That afternoon, while Rex rested in the quiet of his kennel, Mason and Laura scoured through mountains of database files, printouts and handwritten reports in the dusty archives of the facility's records room. Hours bled together into a haze of stale coffee and burning eyes, until Laura, flipping through a battered manila folder, froze mid-mashing. "Mason," she said, her voice suddenly tight, "take a look at this." He hurried to her side. Inside the folder was a faded intake report, nearly 3 years old, for a German Shepherd male approximately 3 years of age at the time of record, bearing a faint scar along the inner side of the left hind leg, just above the hock. Mason's blood went cold. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled up Rex's medical profile from Dr. Monroe's recent exam and matched it side by side. Same scar, same location, same faint jagged line, like a ghost of some old battle waged far away from here. "Unit designation," Mason read aloud, his voice low, K9 217. Status, missing in action, presumed deceased after Operation Nightfall. He slammed the file shut with a crack that echoed through the tiny room. "This isn't just any K9, he said. "This dog is a soldier, one that the system wrote off without even finding a body." Laura's eyes gleamed with something dangerous. "And someone," she added, "wanted to make damn sure he stayed missing." A cold weight settled into Mason's stomach, heavier than guilt, heavier than fear. It was the realization that somewhere out there, someone Rex loved more fiercely than his own survival was still missing, or worse. As Mason stared down at the 2 files side by side, the air in the cramped records room seemed to shift, as if unseen hands were rearranging pieces on a chessboard far bigger than either of them could yet understand. Outside, beyond the cracked window, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel, the first fat drops of rain beginning to spatter against the glass like distant drums. Somewhere deep inside the facility, Rex lifted his head at the sound, his ears pricking forward, his muscles taut with an anticipation that Mason could feel, even from here. The dog was waiting. But now Mason realized it wasn't just waiting, it was remembering. Remembering something vital, something buried under layers of loss and silence. Something that The next 48 hours blurred into a relentless hunt through digital records, yellowed paper files, and long-forgotten archive boxes. Rain lashed the facility's windows, a low, constant hum that seemed to pulse with the urgency knotting Mason's gut. Laura's fingers flew over a battered laptop keyboard while Mason paced behind her, the soles of his boots scuffing rough patterns into the cracked linoleum. "Pull up Operation Nightfall reports again," Mason said, voice rough from sleeplessness. "There's got to be more than just the casualty list." Laura grunted in acknowledgement, eyes narrowed at the screen, and after a long minute she found it. An internal memo dated 3 years ago, stamped top secret but now declassified after a procedural audit. She opened it, her breath catching. Listed under casualties, Staff Sergeant Cole Maddox, KIA, K9 217, presumed KIA. Mason leaned in closer, the words blurring then snapping sharply into focus. His heart stuttered. Cole Maddox. He hadn't heard that name in years, but it rang with the solid, iron-heavy resonance of a fallen monument. Maddox had been legendary among the K9 handlers. Tenacious, loyal, the kind of man who would rather die than abandon his partner. And according to this report, he had. Supposedly, Rex had perished alongside him during a high-risk extraction under heavy enemy fire. But the more Mason read, the more the cracks widened. There was no mention of recovered remains for K9 217. Only presumed dead after search efforts were called off. Mason slammed a palm against the wall, rattling a rusted clipboard from its hook. "Presumed dead," he hissed, pacing like a caged animal. "Not confirmed, they never found Rex's body." Laura stood, her face pale but blazing with realization. "And they didn't exactly look hard, did they?" She flipped to another report. An incident debrief filed by Maddox's commanding officer. Skimming quickly, her brow furrowed deeper. "Listen to this," she read aloud. "Handler found deceased near LZ Bravo. No sign of K9. Search deemed non-viable due to ongoing hostilities. Mission priorities shifted." Mason's fists clenched at his sides. They left him. They left Rex behind, but Rex, stubborn and steadfast to the last breath, hadn't died. He had survived, alone, and somehow he had made it back. Mason turned away, his chest burning, staring out at the rain-smeared world beyond the window. How much suffering had the dog endured in the wilderness of war, waiting for a voice that never came? A low knock at the door pulled them both back to the present. It was Private Jensen, a new recruit barely out of boot camp, holding a dusty, water-stained envelope in his trembling hands. "Sir?" Jensen stammered. "You asked for anything personal linked to Maddox? We found this, stuffed in an old footlocker from the Nightfall storage unit." Mason snatched the envelope, tearing it open with clumsy urgency. Inside, folded crisply despite the years, was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in thick, steady strokes. His eyes scanned the words, and each line hit like a body blow. "If I don't make it back, and they find Rex without me, please don't leave him there. He won't leave me, even if it kills him. Please, find him, bring him home." Mason swallowed hard against the lump rising in his throat. Maddox hadn't been just a soldier issuing instructions. These were the desperate final words of a man begging the world not to forget the loyalty of the creature who had loved him beyond reason. Laura, reading over his shoulder, pressed a hand to her mouth. For a long moment the room was thick with the weight of the unsaid. Then Mason straightened, the paper trembling slightly in his fingers. "He was trying to save Rex," he said, voice low and shaking with fury. Even at the end, he was thinking of Rex. Laura nodded, her expression hardening. "And we failed them both." Silence stretched out, a raw, yawning thing between them. Mason turned the letter over, scanning for more, and his heart jolted again when he spotted something faintly scribbled along the bottom edge, almost too faded to see. "If Rex ever makes it home without me, he'll need help. He'll be scared, he'll be lost, but he'll never stop waiting." Mason stared at the words until they blurred into meaningless squiggles, the rain outside beating harder against the glass like a drum of mourning. "He's still waiting," Mason whispered, more to himself than anyone. Laura's voice was grim but certain. "Then we damn well owe it to both of them to finish what should have been done 3 years ago." Mason crushed the letter against his chest for a moment before carefully folding it and sliding it into his jacket pocket. Outside the kennel windows, the storm began to shift, the dark clouds boiling lower, heavier. An omen that something was stirring, something long buried that was clawing its way back to the surface. Somewhere deep in the bowels of the facility, Rex let out a low, keening whine, a sound not of fear or anger but of profound aching loss. Mason heard it and felt it resonate deep within his bones. He knew then, without needing any further proof, that Rex remembered. The problem was, what else might he remember? The next morning broke with a harsh, steely light cutting through the dispersing rain clouds, bathing the canine facility in a raw, unforgiving glow that seemed to strip every lie and shadow from the world. Mason stood at the center of the empty training yard, the letter from Maddox crumpled tightly in his fist, the words etched into his mind like scars on stone. Rex was not just a dog. He was a survivor of a betrayal that went deeper than Mason could yet see. Laura approached from the side, carrying a folder thick with hastily gathered intel. She didn't need to speak. The urgency blazed in her eyes. "I've pulled every file connected to Operation Nightfall," she said, thrusting the folder into his chest. "And I found something they didn't want us to see." Mason flipped the file open, his gaze falling on a single, overlooked incident report, filed weeks after the mission had been classified as complete. It described an unidentified wounded man discovered wandering near the northern sector of the extraction zone, confused, disoriented, covered in blood, and suffering from severe head trauma. No ID, no recognizable insignia, no dog. "He thought he was a civilian casualty," Laura explained, her voice low and tight. "But look at the physical description: 6'2", brown hair, marine tattoo on left forearm. That's Maddox, Mason, I would bet my badge on it." Mason's mind raced furiously, connecting dots that no one had bothered to connect before. Maddox hadn't died. He had survived the ambush, wounded and lost in the chaos, his mind shattered by injury and shock. But without his dog, without his squad, without his memory, he had been just another anonymous casualty shuffled quietly into the system. Mason's hands trembled with barely contained adrenaline. Where is he now? Laura hesitated. That's the thing, there's no clear record after his intake at the field hospital. He just disappears from the system, like he never existed. "You have to find him," he said, the certainty in his voice as sharp as broken glass. "We owe him that." Laura nodded once, fiercely. "And we start by finding out where they sent him after that field hospital." As Mason and Laura prepared to leave, Mason couldn't help but glance over his shoulder toward Rex's enclosure. The German Shepherd sat upright now, his posture tense, his gaze locked not on the door, but on Mason himself, as if sensing that something was finally shifting, finally breaking loose after years of silent waiting. With Laura working the contacts she had inside the veteran medical network, Mason dug deeper into Rex's side of the story. He requested the original intake files from the day Rex was recovered post-Operation Nightfall, and what he found nearly made his blood run cold. The document listed Rex under a completely different designation, K93142, a dog supposedly rescued from an unrelated conflict zone and repurposed for training at the facility. "They mislabeled him," Mason said aloud, pacing back and forth across the office as Laura listened intently, to get alongside the guys with their guns pointed at them. "He was just another stray with combat potential." Laura's face darkened with fury. "Or maybe they realized," she said quietly, "and they didn't want to deal with the paperwork, with the truth." Mason stared out the window again, the walls of the facility pressing inward like a tomb. Rex had survived unspeakable horrors to find his way back to the only home he knew, and instead of being honored, he had been filed away, rebranded, erased. It was a betrayal so deep it made Mason's stomach churn. "Not anymore," Mason whispered, a promise forged in iron. "We're going to set this right." By nightfall, Mason and Laura were on the road, a crumpled map and a handful of half-buried leads as their only guides. They drove through ghost towns and abandoned outposts, following the faint trail of records that hinted at a man without a name, moving from hospital to hospital, forgotten by the system he had once served. Rex rode in the back seat, his body pressed tightly against the door, his nose occasionally lifting as if catching sketch on the wind that Mason and Laura could not detect. In the dead silence of one particularly empty stretch of highway, Laura turned to Mason. You realized, she said, if Maddox's mind never recovered, he might not even know who he is anymore. He might not recognize Rex. Mason tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitened. He'll recognize, Mason said, his voice absolute. Somewhere inside he'll know, just like Rex knows. The road stretched out endlessly before them, a ribbon of cracked asphalt vanishing into the waiting dark. Every mile they drove felt heavier, more laden with the gravity of what lay ahead. Somewhere out there, a man who had been lost to the world was still waiting to be found. Somewhere out there, a bond severed by blood and time was straining to be made whole again. Mason glanced in the rearview mirror and caught Rex's reflection staring back at him, steady and unblinking, as if daring him to turn back, as if willing him forward. He wouldn't fail them, not again. The dusty hospital loomed ahead like a relic of another century, its peeling paint and broken windows giving it the appearance of a forgotten tomb rather than a sanctuary. Mason pulled the truck to a rough stop beside the sagging entrance, while Laura gathered the sparse documents they had managed to dig up along the way. The trail had led them here, St. Julian's Asylum, a psychiatric facility buried deep in the woods, so far off the map that even the state archives barely acknowledged its existence. Mason tightened his grip on the steering wheel for a beat longer, staring up at the broken signs swinging lazily in the dry wind. He could feel Rex stiffen in the back seat, his massive body tense, his hackles slightly raised. They were close. They could feel it. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of bleach and something older, something rotten that no cleaning agent could fully mask. They were led down a dim corridor by a nurse who spoke in whispers, her shoes squeaking against the cracked tiles. There's someone, she said hesitantly, an old vet, been here years, says strange things sometimes, but if you're looking for soldiers, maybe he knows something. She pushed open a door at the end of the hall, and there, hunched in a chair by the window, sat a man whose skin hung loose over his bones, his hair a thin white cloud around a deeply wrinkled face. His eyes, though, were sharp, flickering with something that looked a lot like undiluted memory. Mr. Holloway, Mason said, crouching beside him, keeping his voice low, steady. We're looking for a man, a soldier. Maybe you saw him? For a moment, Holloway just stared at the window, his fingers twitching rhythmically against his knees. Then, in a voice so raspy it was almost a hiss, he spoke. The woods, he said, night so dark you could drown in it. I saw him. Mason leaned closer, heart pounding. Who, sir? What did you see? Holloway's eyes flicked to Mason's, blazing with sudden clarity. Man, carrying a dog, he whispered. Doggleblood. Man barely walking, heading toward the river line, like he'd die before letting go. Mason's breath caught in his throat. Did you see where they went? Holloway's hands clenched into fists, trembling with the effort of holding the memory. Ran into the trees, into the black, never scribbled notes frantically, her face tight with urgency. When was this? She asked. Holloway blinked, confused, then muttered. After the big booms, after the ground shook. Mason and Laura exchanged a look. It fit. The timeline, the chaos after nightfall, the unclaimed wounded staggering through the forests like living ghosts. Holloway grabbed Mason's sleeve suddenly with surprising strength. They took 'em, boy, he hissed. Took the strong ones. Didn't let 'em be found. Who took them? Mason demanded. But Holloway only sagged back into his chair, eyes glazing over once more, the window stealing his attention away. Outside, the wind howled against the rotting frame, rattling it like a warning. Back at the truck, Laura pulled out her phone, fingers flying as she accessed private databases few people even knew existed. Mason, she said grimly. There's chatter. Underground groups operating in war zones, grabbing surviving K9s after battles, repurposing them. Mason's blood chilled. Repurposing? Yeah, Laura confirmed, her face grim. Illegal fighting rings, mercenary operations, scuggling these dogs. Trained for loyalty, for protection, turned into weapons for profit. Mason stared at Rex in the rearview mirror, the dog's golden eyes locked onto his. It could have been Rex. It almost was Rex. But somehow he had escaped that fate. Somehow, wounded and half-crazed with grief, Rex had torn free from whatever darknet had tried to claim him, and made his way back to the only place he remembered. Mason's fists tightened on the end steering wheel. He felt sick, thinking about how many others hadn't been so lucky. "We need to check the forests near the old river line," he said. "If Maddock ran there, if Holloway saw them, maybe there's something left, something we can use." Laura nodded, determination cutting sharp edges into her features. "We go tonight," she said, "before the trail goes cold for good." As they drove deeper into the decaying countryside, the forest grew thicker, the trees knitting themselves into an almost solid wall of green and shadow. Every so often, Mason would catch Rex lifting his head, his nose twitching as he leaned subtly toward the passenger window, as if trying to catch some elusive, half-forgotten scent. Dusk fell like a stone, plunging the world into a barely visible dirt path. The truck bounced violently over the uneven terrain, headlights slicing through the gloom in erratic beams. At the riverbank they stopped. Mason jumped out first, scanning the area. The ground was soft, heavy with the scent of water and decay. Rex leaped from the truck with a low growl vibrating in his chest, nose immediately to the earth, moving in wide, arcing patterns. They moved forward in silence, the only sounds their breathing and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Suddenly, Rex froze, his body rigid, his ears pinned flat against his skull. Mason hurried to his side and saw what had captured the dog's attention. A half-rotted scrap of military fabric caught on a low-hanging branch, fluttering weakly in the evening breeze. Mason plucked it free and turned it over. A faded name was stitched across the back, almost unreadable in the failing light. Maddox. Mason's heart pounded against his ribs like a war drum. They were close, very close, and somewhere ahead, hidden in the tangle of shadow and memory, the truth waited to be unearthed. The sun was barely a smear of weak gold across the horizon when Mason pulled the truck into the cracked parking lot of the Veteran Rehabilitation Hospital, the low building sagging under decades of unspoken pain and forgotten battles. Rex paced restlessly in the back seat, his movements taut with a kind of electric tension Mason had never seen before, the dog's entire frame vibrating with some instinct far beyond Mason's comprehension. Inside the facility, the air was heavy with antiseptic and the faint metallic tang of old wheelchairs scraping across tile. The corridors stretching ahead in long, sterile lines under the flickering buzz of fluorescent lights. Mason tightened his grip on the leash clipped to Rex's harness, feeling the dog pulling not wildly but with fierce, steady insistence, as if some unseen thread was winding him tighter and tighter toward something inevitable. Laura moved ahead of them, speaking briefly with the head nurse, who gestured down the west wing. "We've got a John Doe," she said softly, glancing warily at Rex. "Came in about 2 years ago. Severe trauma. No ID, no memory. Lost his right arm below the elbow. Doesn't talk much, stays mostly to himself." Mason nodded grimly and followed, Rex now almost dragging him forward, his nails clicking urgently against the tile, his nose raised, sniffing the stale air like a hound on a scent trail. They rounded the last corner, past a cluster of battered armchairs and a long row of windows stained by years of sun and dust, and Mason's breath caught in his throat. There, hunched over on a bench by the far window, sat a man whose frame was both familiar and heartbreakingly foreign. His hair was longer now, shot through with gray, and his right sleeve hung empty, pinned neatly against his side. His posture was one of exhaustion, not just physical but spiritual, as if life itself had become too heavy to bear. Rex's entire body stiffened. Then, without warning, the dog broke free from Mason's slackened grip and shot across the hall, a low, broken sound bursting from his chest like the shattering of glass underwater. Mason surged forward instinctively, heart hammering against his ribs, but he froze when he saw what happened next. Rex didn't tackle the man. He didn't bark wildly or spin circles. Instead, he skidded to a halt directly in front of him, his body lowering into a deep, trembling sit. His eyes locked upward with such raw, searing intensity that Mason felt like an intruder in a moment too sacred for human witness. The man looked up, startled by the sudden presence before him, his left hand twitching reflexively toward where his missing right arm used to be. His face, battered and sunken, wore an expression of utter emptiness, as if whatever fire had once lit those eyes had long since been extinguished. Rex let out a low, throaty whine, the sound thick with desperate hope, and then he gave a single bark, deep and gravelly, the exact bark that had once echoed across battlefields, down rescue tunnels, and through shattered cities. Something flickered in the man's blank gaze. A tremor passed through his shoulders. Slowly, almost painfully, his left hand reached out, trembling violently as it hovered inches above Rex's head. The dog pressed closer, his body shaking, his tail sweeping slow, agonized arcs across the floor. The man's fingers brushed against the coarse fur at the crown of Rex's head, and in that instant, something inside him shattered. Silent tears welled up and spilled down his weathered cheeks, carving clean paths through the dirt and stubble as he clutched Rex to his chest, holding him not with strength, but with a kind of frantic, broken tenderness that spoke louder than any scream. "Rex," the man choked out, the word torn from the depths of some place even memory could not reach. Mason stood frozen several feet away, every muscle in his body locked in awe, the enormity of what he was witnessing stealing the breath from his lungs. Laura clutched his arm tightly, her own face streaked with silent tears, as if the air itself had grown too heavy to bear. The man rocked slowly back and forth, his hand buried in Rex's fur, his body racked by the kind of sobs that stripped a soul raw. And through it all, Rex stayed utterly still, his body pressed solidly against the man's legs, anchoring him, grounding him, reminding him of something fierce and indestructible that had survived the worst the world could throw at them both. Nurses peeked cautiously from behind corners, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. None dared interrupt. In the fading light of that worn, broken corridor, two warriors reunited not with words, not with fanfare, but with the simple, unbreakable gravity of belonging. Mason stepped forward at last, crouching down beside them. "His name's Cole Maddox," he said quietly, voice thick. "He's been waiting for you, buddy, all this time." Rex lifted his head and let out another deep bark, this one softer, almost a rumble of affirmation. Cole's hand tightened in his fur, his face still streaked with tears but his posture slowly straightening, as if the very presence of Rex was stitching broken pieces of him back together one thread at a time. Laura knelt beside Mason, her eyes shining. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Mason stared at them, man and dog, each scarred, each battered, each refusing to let the other be lost to time, and knew that their fight was far from over. Because somewhere out there, the darkness that had tried to consume them was still waiting, still watching, still ready to strike again. For one breathless moment, it seemed as though the reunion had stitched every broken piece back into place. Man and dog locked in an unspoken bond that transcended time and trauma. But the weight of years and the scars carved too deep to see were not so easily banished. As Rex pressed closer, nuzzling against Cole's chest with a soft whimper, something inside the wounded soldier snapped. Cole stiffened violently, his left hand shoving hard against Rex's massive shoulder, pushing the dog back with a strength born not of cruelty but of blind, overwhelming panic. Rex stumbled, his paws scrabbling slightly against the polished floor, confused but unwilling to resist. Cole staggered to his feet, swaying sharp and ragged, his one arm swinging protectively in front of him as though fending off an invisible enemy. His eyes, once softened by tears, now blazed with terror and betrayal, darting around the corridor as if expecting an ambush. "Get back," he rasped, voice raw, cracking under the strain of old nightmares clawing their way to the surface. Rex crouched low, tail tucked, his body language a perfect picture of submission and confusion, unwilling to move closer but equally unwilling to abandon the man he had crossed hell to find. Mason moved instinctively, stepping between them, hands raised in a calming gesture. "Cole," he said carefully, keeping his voice low and steady, "it's okay, you're safe. You're not there anymore." But Cole didn't hear him, or if he did, the words couldn't breach the roaring chaos behind his shattered gaze. Laura edged closer too, her posture wary, ready to intervene if the situation turned dangerous, though every instinct screamed that violence was the last thing either man or dog needed right now. Rex whimpered again, a soft, broken sound, and Cole flinched as if struck. He stumbled back another step, his body rigid with the primal need to flee, to protect what little pieces of himself still remained. "Stay down," he barked instinctively, the words flying from his mouth without thought, driven by sheer survival reflex. Rex's ears snapped up instantly, his entire body dropping into a perfect downstay position. muzzle brushing the floor, eyes locked unwaveringly on Cole's face with an expression of absolute obedience and love. The command, so deeply ingrained, so achingly familiar, sliced through the terror like a blade through fog. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Mason felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck as the enormity of the moment unfolded before him. Cole stood frozen, the echo of his own voice hanging in the air, the familiarity of the reaction pulling something from the dark, broken recesses of his mind. He blinked and blinked again, and for the first time, true recognition began to flicker behind his storm-tossed eyes. "Rex," he whispered, the name crumbling from his lips like ancient stone. Rex's tail thudded once against the floor, tentative, hopeful. Cole swayed where he stood, his face contorting in pain, confusion, and the desperate need to understand. His hand, trembling, lifted halfway as if reaching out, then stopped mid-air, frozen by fear of what he might find if he touched again. Mason stepped forward slowly, his voice a threadbare whisper. "You remembers you, Cole," Mason said. He never stopped. Cole's mouth worked soundlessly, his breathing fast and shallow. His gaze darted from Mason to Rex and back again, the war raging behind his eyes more visible than any scar etched into his skin. Rex didn't move. He didn't inch closer. He simply waited, as he always had, his faith unshakable, his heart laid bare before the man he had been willing to die for. A low, keening noise escaped Cole's throat, a sound of grief and longing and bone-to-heap regret. He staggered forward a single, halting step, Rex's body tensed, but not in fear, in readiness, in hope. Another step. Cole's fingers twitched at his side, his chest heaving with the weight of memories clawing their way free. The corridor, the walls, the sterile smell of bleach, all of it dissolved under the tidal wave of a memory not erased but buried, raw and ragged and roaring back to life. "Rex," Cole said again, stronger now, the word a lifeline thrown across the abyss. This time, when he reached out, Rex carefully to meet him, every movement slow, deliberate, asking permission. Cole's hand found the dog's massive head, and the contact broke something loose inside him that could no longer be contained. His knees buckled, and Mason lunged forward instinctively, but Rex was already there, bracing himself against Cole's side, taking the full weight without flinching. Cole collapsed to the floor, burying his face in Rex's fur, his body racked with silent sobs, tears soaking into the thick coat as his left hand fisted desperately into the warm, familiar presence that had never truly abandoned him. Mason knelt beside them but did not speak, did not interfere. Some things were too sacred for human intervention. Laura crouched on the other side, tears shining unshed in her eyes. The hospital staff had gathered silently at the far end of the hall, drawn by the unearthly stillness, the heavy, heartbreaking beauty of the reunion unfolding before them. No one dared intrude. The world narrowed to a single point, a man, broken but not beyond repair, and a dog, wounded but unyielding, binding themselves together again with the only language that mattered. Love, loyalty, forever. The days that followed the reunion unfolded in slow, careful steps, as if the universe itself held its breath, terrified that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile miracle that had bloomed in the sterile halls of the Veterans Hospital. Mason and Laura visited daily, bringing food, clean clothes, and whatever pieces of comfort they could scrape together, each item a thread painstakingly stitched into the frayed fabric of Cole Maddox's shattered identity. Rex refused to leave Cole's side, following him like a living shadow, his every movement a wordless vow to stay, to anchor, to heal. But memory, Mason knew, was not a switch to be flipped back on with love alone. It was a battlefield littered with traps and scars and ghosts that waited in the dark. One afternoon, as storm clouds bruised the horizon, Laura arrived clutching an old, battered duffel bag they had retrieved from the long-abandoned evidence locker at Fort Rains, the last official base where Maddox had been stationed before Operation Nightfall had swallowed him whole. Mason watched as she knelt carefully before Cole, who sat slouched in a cracked armchair near the window, staring blankly at the rain slashing against the glass. "We found this," Laura said gently, unzipping the bag. "It's yours, Cole. Thought maybe something inside could help." Cole didn't respond, but Rex, lying curled at his feet, lifted his head sharply, nostrils flaring. Laura pulled out a bundle of items, setting them slowly on the floor. A dog-eared photo of a younger Maddox and Rex standing tall against a sun-bleached desert. A medal with a cracked ribbon, a battered canteen, and finally a military-issue jacket, torn along one sleeve, stained dark in places that no amount of washing could ever clean. The instant the jacket hit the floor, Rex's demeanor shifted violently. The massive German shepherd surged to his feet, tail skiff, body quivering as he sniffed the air with frantic urgency. A low whine escaped his throat, high and sharp, and then, as if some unseen force had seized him, Rex began to spin in tight, desperate circles, his claws scrabbling against the floor as he cawed at the jacket, raking his paws across the worn fabric with an urgency that bordered on panic. Mason lunged forward, trying to calm him, but Laura caught his arm and shook her head. "Let him," she said, voice thick. "He's remembering." Rex nudged the jacket with his nose, then pressed his head against it, rubbing his muzzle back and forth in a frenzied motion, breathing it in like a drowning man gulping air. His body trembled, torn between joy and anguish, and then he let out a long, keening howl that filled the room with a grief so raw it ripped through Mason like shrapnel. Cole's head snapped up, eyes wild and glassy, his body stiffening as if electrified. His mouth opened, but no words came. He stared at Rex, stared at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time. Rex barked once, sharp, commanding, a sound that demanded recognition. Cole flinched backward, hands clutching at the arms of the chair, but his gaze never wavered from the dog he had once trained, once trusted with his life. Somewhere deep inside the labyrinth of trauma and lost years, something shifted, something cracked. That night, Mason sat by Cole's bedside, unwilling to leave him alone during the storm that raged outside, the windows rattling like bones. Laura dozed lightly in the corner, and Rex lay sprawled across Cole's feet, an immovable guardian against nightmares. Cole tossed and turned fitfully, caught in the throes of a battle Mason couldn't see but could feel in the charged air of the room. Then, without warning, Cole let out a sharp cry, his back arching off the mattress, sweat pouring down his face. "Get back! Get back!" Rex rose instantly, tense, ears pricked forward, but did not move closer. Mason leaned in, heart pounding, helpless to do anything but bear witness. Cole thrashed, caught in the nightmare's vice grip, but then, through the garbled panic, a single, clear word broke free. "Rex!" Cole cried, his voice cracking under the weight of memory and loss. "Rex, stay!" Mason froze, his throat closing. Laura jerked awake, staring wide-eyed across the room. Rex whined low in his throat, moving closer to the bed in slow, measured steps, his massive head lowering submissively as he approached. Cole's breathing hitched, his body trembling with the effort of surfacing from the nightmare's depths. His left hand groped blindly at the air until it found Rex's fur, fisting tightly in the thick coat. "Good boy," he whispered hoarsely, the words half choked by emotion. "Good boy, Rex." Mason swallowed hard against the lump rising in his chest. Laura covered her mouth with one hand, tears gleaming in her eyes. Rex settled his heavy head on Cole's chest, his body going utterly still, offering warmth, offering weight, offering something real to cling to. The storm outside began to ebb, the thunder fading into a distant, sullen growl. Inside, the room settled into a fragile peace, stitched together with the simplest, strongest bond either man or dog had ever known. Mason sat back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at his bones, but he smiled through the tight ache in his chest. Cole Maddox had not been lost, not really. The enemy had stolen his time, his memories, his body, but they had never taken the core of him, the part that knew Rex, the part that knew loyalty, that knew love, and somewhere Mason knew that stubborn, battered core would soon fight its way back to the surface. The days blurred into one another, a relentless march of therapy sessions, paperwork, and slow, agonizing fragments of memory clawing their way back into Cole Maddox's mind. But Mason knew that healing Cole's mind wasn't enough. Not if the truth, the real truth about Operation Lifefall remained buried under layers of official lies and convenient forgetfulness. Laura dug harder than ever, her network of contacts stretching thin, her laptop a mess of half-loaded classified files and dead-end leads. Then, one night, as the hospital slept and rain drummed a steady dirge against the windows, Laura burst into the small common room where Mason and Cole were sharing silent coffee. her face pale and alight with the kind of furious triumph that only came when someone found something they were never supposed to see. "I got it," she said, her voice shaking. "I found it." Mason was on his feet instantly, heart hammering against his ribs. Laura slammed her battered laptop onto the table, spinning it around so they could see. On the screen, grainy footage began to play, a time-stamped video file buried deep in a forgotten military archive labeled only with a string of meaningless numbers. The footage wobbled slightly as the drone's camera adjusted, the desert landscape below bleak and endless. Figures moved through the dust, small at first, barely recognizable as soldiers. Andrews said it was Cole, younger, still whole, moving low and fast across the kill zone with a precision that spoke of long, brutal training. And right beside him, Rex, sleek, powerful, hyper-focused, his body a shadow against Cole's side. The audio was muted, but the violence was unmistakable. Bullets shredded the ground around them, mortar fire raining down like iron hail. A split-second decision caught in agonizing clarity. Cole thrown violently backward by an explosion, crumpling into a twisted heap, his weapons skittering out of reach. Soldiers scattered, retreating under heavy fire, some waving frantically at Cole to move, to follow. But he didn't, couldn't. And Rex didn't run. Rex turned, charging back through the smoke and blood, leaping over debris with reckless abandon. The dog slammed into Cole's body, using his full weight to shield him from a second wave of shrapnel that tore into the earth just feet away. Mason's hands tightened into fists as he watched, helpless, as Rex tugged at Cole's gear, dragging him by sheer force toward the cover of a shattered wall, dragged him inch by inch across a hellscape that no living thing should have survived. Laura hit pause, the screen freezing on an image so stark it burned itself into Mason's brain. Rex, battered and bleeding, standing protectively over Cole's broken body, his teeth bared in a defiant snarl as enemy fire rained around them. Mason looked at Cole, whose face was ghostly pale, his hand trembling as he reached out and touched the screen with his fingertips, as if unsure whether it was real or another fragment of a dream. "You saved me," he whispered, voice raw with awe and grief. Mason's jaw tightened. "No, buddy," he said softly. "You saved each other." Laura took a shaky breath, swiping to the next file, her hands almost reverent. "There's more," she said grimly. "Another video, this one recorded later in a dim, hastily assembled field tent, the image jittery as if the cameraman wanted no official record. A group of men, all high-fin, surrounded a battered Cole Maddox, who sat dazed and broken, his uniform torn and stained dark. The men's faces were shadowed, but their voices were clear. "You will say nothing," one of them barked. "Not about the ambush, not about the withdrawal order, not about the K9. Cole blinked at them, confusion etched deep into every line of his body. "But," he croaked, "a plan. It wasn't supposed to." A heavy hand slammed down on his shoulder, cutting him off. "There was no plan. You hear me? No deviations. You were never there. Your dog was never there. Understand?" Cole flinched, instinctively shrinking into himself. "Cat," he whispered. Another man leaned closer, voice a low, deadly purr. "Because if anyone finds out the extraction coordinates were botched, if anyone finds out we sent 2 units into a crossfire because of a bad intel feed, careers die. Commanders fall. You think they'll care about a grunt and his mutt?" Mason felt bile rise in his throat. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms to stay grounded. They hadn't just abandoned Cole. They had buried him. They had buried Rex. All to protect themselves. Cole stared blankly at the screen, the old pain resurfacing with brutal clarity. He lifted his gaze to Mason, and for the first time since this nightmare began, fury burned in his eyes. Cold, clear, righteous. "They left us to die," he said, each word a hammer blow. Mason nodded, his own voice low and steady. "And now we bring the truth back into the light." Rex shifted beside Cole, pressing his weight gently against the man's leg, a silent, unwavering promise. Outside, the storm raged harder, as if the heavens themselves were boiling with rage. And Mason knew deep in his bones, this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice. The next steps unfolded like a campaign, not rushed, not frantic, but deliberate, calculated. A battle plan crafted with the steady hands of those who had nothing left to lose but everything left to honor. Mason and Laura worked late into the nights gathering files, recording statements, pulling every scrap of evidence from a system that had tried so hard to bury the past. While Cole trained himself to walk the halls again without flinching, without looking over his shoulder, without waiting for a bullet that would never come, Rex remained his constant shadow, silent and strong, the living proof that no lie, no order, no betrayal had truly severed the bond forged in fire and blood. When Mason proposed the idea of taking the fight public, Cole's answer was not loud or angry, but it was ironclad. "We owe it to the ones who didn't come back," he said. His voice steady, the ghost of the battlefield lingering in his gaze. "We owe it to ourselves." The hearing was set in a government building so sterile it seemed almost to resist the passion that would soon ignite its cold walls. A closed-door session meant to quietly review the surrounding Operation Nightfall, but Mason knew better. They wanted it buried again, swept neatly under bureaucratic rugs, another footnote lost in classified files. Not this time. Cole stood at the podium, his right sleeve pinned up neatly, his medals polished but worn, his stance that of a soldier stripped to his essence, no longer hiding behind broken memories. Rex sat at his heel, wearing his old service vest, the once tattered insignia now stitched lovingly back into place, gleaming under the fluorescent light. Cameras rolled, reporters scribbled, officers watched with narrowed, calculating eyes. Cole spoke first, his testimony clean, brutal, undeniable. But it wasn't until the footage played the grainy, devastating images of a dog refusing to abandon his handler. A handler dragged from the jaws of death. The room shifted palpably, the tide turning with the force of a storm. Laura presented the recovered memos, the orders rescinding the rescue mission, the internal cover-up documents, signed by hands now sweating under the scrutiny of flashing cameras and recording pens. Rex's presence was the final blow. When Cole finished recounting the day he almost died, when he knelt quietly beside Rex and gave the old command "Guard," and the German Shepherd instantly moved into position, alert and protective, the room fell into an electric silence. No one could deny what stood before them. Loyalty made flesh. Truth made living proof. The tribunal faltered, their carefully prepared counters and procedural technicalities crumbling under the weight of what Mason had known from the start, that sometimes the strongest evidence doesn't come in words or signatures, but in the steady thud of a dog's heartbeat against a broken man's side. Days later, the results were made public. Operation Nightfall was declared a tactical failure due to leadership negligence. Medals revoked from those who had ordered the withdrawal, and Cole Maddox's name officially cleared of any wrongdoing. But it wasn't just about a certificate or a statement. It was about reclaiming something deeper, something no bureaucracy could grant or deny: dignity, truth, home. As they left the building, the afternoon sun was brilliant against the courthouse steps, the air thick with the murmur of reporters and onlookers. Cole paused halfway down the stairs, looking out across the plaza where other veterans gathered, their faces lined with understanding, with respect. Rex stood beside him, tail wagging gently, not in excitement but in a quiet, almost solemn acknowledgement that the mission was complete. Mason clapped Cole lightly on the shoulder, grinning. "It wasn't me they believed," he said, scratching behind Rex's ears. "It was him." Laura wiped a tear from her eye discreetly, pretending to adjust her sunglasses. "Both of you," she said. "You brought each other back." They spent the evening at the old training fields behind Fort Rains, the base now decommissioned, the fences sagging and the buildings hollowed by time. It was here they had first become a team, before war and politics and betrayal had tried to tear them apart. Rex bounded through the high grass, chasing invisible enemies, his joy unrestrained, while Cole watched from a battered bench, a slow smile softening the hard lines of his face. "He was never just a tool," Cole said suddenly, almost to himself. "He was always more, always better than they deserved." Mason nodded, not trusting his voice, feeling the truth of it settle in his bones. Night fell slow and golden, the sky bleeding out into a sea of stars. Mason, Laura, and Cole built a small fire from scraps of old wood, sitting close as the chill crept in. Rex lay between them, paws twitching occasionally as he dreamed, perhaps of desert sands or long-forgotten battlefields, Or maybe, Mason hoped, of peaceful fields and endless running. As the flames crackled low, Cole turned to Mason, his face serious, lit from below like some ancient warrior king. "What do we do now?" he asked. Mason smiled. "We live," he said simply. "We live the way they would have wanted us to, free. Together." Cole leaned back, letting the firelight warm his battered body, his soul slowly stitching itself whole again. Rex shifted closer, his massive head resting across Cole's boots in a gesture of tragedy. Two souls, once lost in the smoke and ruin of war, now tethered by something stronger than fate, something no order could destroy, no battlefield could erase. They had been broken, yes, but they had not been defeated. They had found their way home. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me while writing it, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more powerful journeys like this. I'd love to know what was the moment that hit you the hardest, and where are you tuning in from? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here.